So very nice to see you all. Familiar faces, some names, new names to me. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining our NTI conversation today on the fascinating topic of the role of mindfulness in helping emotional and nervous system regulation through an ADHD and neuroscience lens. Yes, so my name is Dr. Katya Todarella. I'm an interim head of health and social well-being and applied mindfulness program at NTI. Let us start with the acknowledgement of country. In this period of reconciliation, the NTI Institute would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we walk, study, and reside, the Wadi Wadi people of the Darawal Nation. I also want to acknowledge the land on which we all reside, as we pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and extend those respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of today. Before we proceed, just a quick housekeeping, if I can manage it from my end, but if you can keep an eye on your mic so that I'm mute at the beginning, that would be great. If you would like to ask a question, please, by all means, write it in the chat or raise your digital hand. I also would like to mention that Jen, our speaker today, whom I will introduce shortly, kindly agreed to share her presentation with those interested. So if you would like to have the copy of today's presentation, please write to me in the chat. I will leave my email address at the end of the presentation of our conversation today, and I will be happy to send you that presentation later through the email. So let me start with the it's my pleasure to introduce Jen today. She's my good friend, Jen Lewis, with whom we met during the mindfulness-based stress reduction program in 2019. It was a passion for mindfulness that brought us together. She is an amazing professional person, kind and inspirational. Jen is a founder of JLU HQ, ADHD and a business coach, and she's also a well-being educator and facilitator, helping organizations and individuals with burnout proofing as well. Excuse me. Her background spans over 25 years in business coaching, people development, and soft skills facilitation. Jen is an ADD Coach Academy qualified ADHD coach, a member of the International Coaching Federation Association, and Australasian ADHD Professionals Association, as well as Institute of Executive Coaching and Leadership Institute coach as well. Also, Jen holds multiple neuroscience and children's emotions coaching credentials, a master's in commerce, strategy, innovation, and is a fully qualified mindfulness teacher in the gold standard of mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn's clinical program, there in the MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. I hope I covered it all. Jen, welcome to this conversation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Katya. Perhaps it should be critical training, not clinical.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you everybody for coming today. These are probably my favorite subjects to combine: the ADHD, the neuroscience, and the mindfulness, and they all combine beautifully in together. So yeah, I'm going to take you through this presentation in 3 different parts. First of all, We're going to talk about the role of perception, because I think without fully being engaged in the role of perception and fully understanding that, which most people probably do today, that we can't really go into that foundational mindfulness and the ADHD side. So we're going to talk a lot about the role of perception in our minds and our bodies, our emotions. And then we're also going to look at some of the differences from an ADHD processing system in general to a neurotypical processing system. And I say in general because every human is different, right? But in general, the ADHD processing system. And then we'll talk about the mindfulness aspect and how it is so essential and helpful for people with an ADHD processing system, for humans in general, but especially given the emotional dysregulation aspect of most people with ADHD. So, Katya, if I ask the audience a question, would you rather they put it in the chat box or shout out?
Both are okay.
Okay, yeah, we're quite a
We're
small
gonna
group
try.
today, so yeah, maybe we can shout out. So, does anybody want to share, just so that we can get on the same page with what your thoughts are? What do we mean by perception? I can't see the chat box just in case. Oh, yes, I can.
Meredith, okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Meredith. Yep, the way we view the world through our senses and our view of the world, exactly that. Yep. So, how we experience the world and how we experience the world, we'll take a deeper look into this, but it's built out of so many things, right? And people think that when we're in this 90% odd of our thoughts, our behaviors, our actions that are kind of running out of this programming, our conditioning, but we think that our perception is so true. So first of all, we're going to look today at how perception is created, and I guess how flimsy it can be. I mean, we can all be sat here in a room today and we'll all watch something unfold, and likely we will all have a bit of a different perception of what just happened and what's going on, and that can depend on so many things. So even to the point of somebody walks in a room and we judge them, right? We judge them out of our awareness. We judge them on what they look like. We judge them on what they're wearing. And it's not a conscious thing, but we even judge them when they open their mouth. If they have an accent, we might gravitate towards them, right? If they have the same accent as us. If they have a grumpy look on their face, we might think, oh, they look like a grumpy person. So we're judging, and we're building this perception out of our awareness all the time. So I thought we might do exercise first up to take a look at this perception thing. So let's think. A good friend who usually joins you for a lunchtime walk, they haven't done so for the last few days, even though you've messaged them several times saying you miss them and you'd really like them to join you. And then when you sit back and think about it, actually, they have been a lot less responsive lately. So I'd love to hear, maybe if everybody can put something in the chat, I'd love to hear what might be going on, what might be your go-to, what could that mean? Yeah, could be overworked, could be depressed. Yeah, something's challenging in their world. They're mad at me. They're busy. They're not doing okay. Give them space. Oh, isn't that interesting? Up until this week, I'd assume they've done something wrong, but now I think their email or phone isn't working. So yeah, Meredith, that's really interesting. I wonder what's happened this week to have you change your default perception of something. Sick, unhappy. Yeah, I wonder what they think about me, right? So my old brain says it's another friend lost. How beautiful. Yeah. And that's just a great display as well, right? Of the different brain states that we can be in. our evolution, ourself, might change our perception, because it is the way that we're wired. It absolutely is. So I love the fact that somebody said, up until this week and my old brain, so your wiring was different, and you've probably done something on a conscious level to have this evolved brain and this new brain. So perception, let me ask you this. Would your perception of that situation be different depending on whether you were having an abundant week and your work was going really well? If you've got kids, they were being super to you, your friendships, versus if you'd have just, work was going terribly, you might be losing your job, your kids are not doing what you want them to, you haven't seen any friends for weeks. Could your perception of this situation be different depending on your emotional state? Jody, yes, yes, very different. Of course, yes. So this is huge, right? Because we are usually stuck in this rigid perception much of the time. And we don't stop to think. Well, maybe people here do, but the majority of people who don't know this stuff and aren't conscious to this, we don't often stop to think, okay, what state am I in today? What's happening for me that I might be bringing to this situation? So what makes up our perception in the world? So these are some of the main things that influence our perception, right? So the information we barely ever have all of the information about a situation. I had an old boss that said to me once years ago, and it really stuck. He said, Jen, in the absence of information, people assume the negative, right? And it's so, so true. Rick Hansen, he's a expert in brain bias, and he talks about how our brains are Teflon for the positive and Velcro for the negative, unless we make these conscious decisions, right? Unless we bring that unconscious into the conscious. And I can remember a few years ago, and this is me who knows all of this stuff and practices this stuff, I still get caught. I was at my son's martial arts grading. It was a Sunday, and the martial arts Dan, he's the guy who runs the place. I'd never met him before, and it was on a Sunday morning, and there was all these kids there doing their martial arts grading, and it was such a wonderful morning. And this guy, he stood up at the front, and the whole time I just kept looking at him thinking, he looks so grumpy. He's not smiled once. Wow. And here's me caught in my unconscious. And I just thought, perhaps he's past it. Maybe he doesn't enjoy it anymore. Perhaps he should retire. And lo and behold, he stood there at the end and he said, please excuse me if I look really grumpy. I have Parkinson's. What an example. And how terrible I felt, of course. But what an example. We've never got all of the information. So these things that influence our perception, we hold our perceptions so rigidly like they're fact. But somebody can give us a bit of information about somebody and our whole perception just changes. So our current emotional state, prefrontal cortex regulation, and we'll talk about that in a minute when we're talking about the ADHD system, but our prefrontal cortex, if we've got it online with our limbic system and everything's working in harmony, then we're able to kind of come out of ourselves and see a situation more objectively. Might be that, might not be that. And then, of course, our attitudes. And a couple of you have already said today that your old way of thinking versus your new way of thinking. So that the way that we're wired, our new neuroplasticity, do we default to a certain reaction to things? You'll all know if you miss a flight, you'll probably know whether your default reaction to that would be, there's another one, or scrambling into kind of dysregulation. So yeah, and our belief systems, right? We have these strong belief systems that are underpinning our perceptions all the time. There's an effective she works in effective neuroscience, Lisa Feldman. She's got this book, How Emotions Are Made. And I absolutely love what she said. I think I've got a slide on this. I do. She says in her book, you know that old saying, seeing is believing? She turns it on her head and she says, believing is seeing. right? So everything that we come to a situation with, we're normally bringing that kind of unconscious perceptions to the situation. There is over 100 cognitive biases running at any one time. And I know that this slide's not big enough to see all of the words on it, but I will share with you that one of my favorite biases that we run is we think we know what others are thinking. And we absolutely do. We make these assumptions and we think we know what others are thinking, but we don't. We don't. And it's so liberating to know this stuff and to live in this stuff that we don't know. There could be 100 different things going on for people we don't know. But this stuck in this black and white thinking, many people with ADHD, one of the traits, there's so many nuances and so many traits to ADHD, but one of them is that people with ADHD are often stuck in a lot more black and white thinking. They don't, we don't, I should say, navigate the gray as often. And I remember same boss said to me 15 years ago that I needed to learn to navigate the gray. And I had no idea what he meant by that. And I said, no, well, things are. They're either that or they're that. Boy, I was wrong. There's a lot of gray to things. And once we start to understand that, it's just so liberating. So I want to just explain the, and many of you, again, I don't know what stages you're at, but many of you may already know this, but I want to explain the, first of all, actually, it's probably more helpful if I explain this first. So Dan Siegel, he's a professor of psychiatry at UCLA, absolute powerhouse, written many good books. So he has this really good handy model of the brain in the palm of your hand. So I'll just explain how this works in the 3 different ways in relation to emotional regulation. So we've got this brain stem here, right? Oldest part, scanning for threat, maybe 200 times a minute. Am I safe? Am I not safe? And then you've got this prefrontal cortex up here, this newer part of the brain. This prefrontal cortex is able to regulate. So it's responsible for goal setting, planning, regulation. It's in the ADHD world, it's called the executive function. And so so this prefrontal cortex up here, the executive function of the brain, this is typically where you see most of the impairments in an ADHD system. So organizing, prioritizing, focusing, regulating, managing frustration, memory recall, and regulating action. So you'll see this executive function, this prefrontal cortex, there's a lot of regulation happening here. So if we go back to Dan Siegel's handy model of the brain, and this here, how he explains it, is the juicy old limbic system. So that's the one that's responsible for our emotions. And when something hits our emotional system pretty hard, when we're feeling quite emotional about something, what happens is this prefrontal cortex, the way that he describes it, gets knocked offline, right? And now the way I like to describe it, when we're running completely from our limbic system, now the lunatics are running the asylum a little bit. This is when we're completely dysregulated, right? So what's actually happening here is that the pathways between the frontal cortex and the limbic system, they're constricted when we're feeling something so emotionally. So we do move to that black and white thinking, and it's kind of, I'm right, you're wrong. If anybody here has ever received an email that has really sent their prefrontal cortex offline, and who hasn't been a keyboard warrior, I'll show them, I'll tell them, send, and it feels really good at the time. As this prefrontal cortex slowly comes back online, you might look at that email in a couple of days and think, that was a bit harsh, wasn't it? That's probably not fact. So when these 2 things are working in perfect harmony, we're able to have our emotional part and our rational objective part see the whole picture. And we're able to see multiple perceptions or perspectives. So COVID times actually is a great example, isn't it, of that that lunatics running the asylum when we were all running into the shops for toilet paper and pasta. I say me, not me. I do online shopping. But that's a great example, because you got people who were running out of their fear base. They were running out of, oh my God, what do I do here? Grab all of the toilet paper. And this prefrontal cortex wasn't so much in the picture. So I just want to take you through, now we kind of understand this role of perception. When this is running in perfect harmony, we're able to see that full picture, but our perception can be very skewed when we're running out of this emotional center. So most people with ADHD have a smaller window of tolerance biologically than, say, people without ADHD. And there's a great trauma expert, Janina Fisher. I think she used to work for Harvard, and she's been teaching trauma for over 30 years. And she likened the ADHD system to the trauma nervous system. So if you think about our window of tolerance, I think, yeah, this is another Dan Siegel model. So this window of tolerance, when we are regulated, when our brain and our body and everything is in perfect harmony, we're in this window where we're safe enough to learn, we're calm enough to learn, and these two things are working in perfect harmony, and we're able to see things from that multiple perspectives. People with ADHD in general get knocked out of their window of tolerance a lot quicker. So depending on what research you read, people with ADHD, between 30 to 70% of them also have comorbid anxiety. And if you think about when you're knocked into anxiety, that's this top level, right? This I'm not safe, I'm in hyper arousal state. So their nervous system is more dysregulated than that of their neurotypical peers. So people with ADHD have to work a lot harder to stay regulated. And then there's the bottom where it's hypoarousal. So it's like that foot on the brake. And it's like that sent into hypoarousal shutdown, right? It's the shutdown response. So people with ADHD, same as people with trauma systems, they get knocked out of this window of tolerance more often. They've also got, there's a fair few studies to show HRV, so heart rate variability. What that means is if your heart rate variability is lower, that means your body's response to stress is better. So if it's higher, which people with ADHD are, it's a bit like that window of tolerance, right? It gets knocked out more easily, and it's a bit more difficult for the body to be resilient to stress. So you've got the ADHD operating system in general. So smaller window of tolerance, get knocked out of that nervous system more easily, HRV, and then you've got that slower prefrontal wave activity. So that exec function, that prefrontal cortex we go back to, which means that for many people with ADHD, they're operating out of their limbic system a bit more strongly than their neurotypical peers. So that's can be why mindfulness is so super helpful for people with ADHD. And can I just get a I can't see everybody. I'm wondering how to get a show of hands of Katya, maybe you can let me know. For people in this room today, is everybody across mindfulness, or are there some newcomers, or what kind of audience, what level is the audience at, I guess, for mindfulness?
We can ask everyone just to write a word.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Or a newcomer. That would be great too. And Sarah also asked a question. She said, I also suffer chronic pain. Does that affect the front part of my brain? That's towards what you were talking about before. You can answer it a bit later or now, whatever feels.
Okay. As someone who has ADHD and ASD, this is very interesting. I always assume the worst. Yeah. It's hard to read faces as well. Yes. And sorry, what was the other? Was that the same?
Yes,
Sarah asking about pain as well?
Yeah, also suffer chronic pain. Does that affect the front part of the brain?
Interestingly, I'm not actually sure. Does chronic pain affect the front part of the brain? I certainly know that mindfulness, I mean, the reason Katya and I, when we learned our teacher training, the John Kabat-Zinn program, that was developed in the first place for people that were in chronic pain, and even to the extent of end of life, terminal illnesses, chronic pain, basically where the hospitals couldn't do any more with them. And so John Kabat-Zinn developed this program that was for helping chronic pain. And there's a Timothea Goddard. She was on an ABC iView program, and they followed people. It's really interesting. It's got about 6 or 8 people, and they followed people over months for this MBSR program, and followed, were they more resilient to pain afterwards? And absolutely they were. It was super helpful. So I'm not too sure if it affects the front part of the brain. What I do know is that mindfulness-based stress reduction is awesome for pain. It's apparently very scientific. And what I also do know is that the mindfulness increases the matter in the prefrontal cortex and decreases the action in the amygdala. So it's I was just thinking that was the last section. You've just brought it up for me. Yeah, we do know that mindfulness, but as someone with ADHD and ASD, yeah. So I assume that you mean by, I always assume the worst sometimes, is about the perception, absolutely, and the anxiety. So perception, if we run out of our emotional system, remember what Rick Hansen said, that our brains are Teflon for the bad, and Teflon for the good. And so we do always assume the worst, typically, unless we're conscious to it. But we can absolutely do things to change our emotional regulation. Yeah. So I relate to this a lot. So sorry, I don't know the answer to the question, does chronic pain affect the front part of the brain? But everything that I just said before, I do know that a lot of other stuff affects chronic pain. I have a practice fairly across. Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much. Can trauma exacerbate ADHD? Love that question, Jodie. So I have hundreds of clients with ADHD, and interestingly, even though there's so many different research pieces that say that they're different, the symptoms are very similar. What I've heard is that if it's trauma, that's probably more resolvable than ADHD, because ADHD is a processing system. Can trauma exacerbate ADHD? I'm going to subjectively, I don't know, I have not seen research on this that I can call to mind right now, but subjectively, yes, absolutely, because trauma also narrows your window of tolerance, and it gives you a more jumpy nervous system. So if you put that together with ADHD, if you think about when we're dysregulated, we don't remember things as well. All right. So even think, if you've lost your keys, if you're regulated and you can go, oh, when did I last have them? But if we're dysregulated in any way, then of course all of those symptoms are going to be exacerbated. And most people that you talk to with ADHD, if they're dysregulated, and trauma dysregulates. So yes, I would say absolutely. And working on both of them would be super helpful. Yeah. Chronic pain, this would prompt a survival response. So access to the, that makes sense, doesn't it, Christine? That makes a lot of sense. So yeah. Okay. Thank you for your questions. And that has just made me completely forget where I was. I'm also, Katya knows this, I'm also coming off the back of, I was really sick last week, and I've got 1.5 blocked ears. This ear is completely blocked, and this one's coming in and out. So I'm, a little bit fuggy today. So, so estimated that by age 12, children who have ADHD receive 20,000 more negative messages from parents, teachers, and other adults than their neurotypical peers. So if you think about this perception thing, if people with ADHD are living in a world that's a bit more wonky to them anyway, and a little bit, they feel a bit different, and they internalize that, and then they're getting these messages from external, whether meant or not, because ADHD is a different processing system. So you can imagine when we go back to that, what is our perception made up out of, their nervous systems are already kind of going into defensive state. And I deal with a lot of people with rejection sensitive dysphoria, which means it's people who are disproportionately affected by fear of rejection. So this is all intertwined. And so when people are receiving much more negative messages, their perception is also going to be kind of on the defense and seeing things potentially a bit differently. So Thomas E. Brown, he's written some great books, by the way, on ADHD, but he said individuals with ADHD can be swept away by an emotion fast. And we can see this with that nervous system that we just talked about. And yeah, Dr. Dodson, so he's a psychiatrist, and he says the ADHD nervous system is rarely at rest, right? That's another interesting thing to know. It's so interesting that it's called attention deficit, because it is not a deficit. People with ADHD have probably more attention than anyone else, but it's just not in the right place. Right? So it's when we come home and we forget to put our keys on the hook, it's not because our attention is in deficit, it's because our attention is in surplus here and there and there and there. So really it should be called attention surplus disorder. But yeah, it's just the focus. And they say that it's like 4 or 5 people rattling around in your head at any one time. So this nervous system is really important to work on as much as possible. In my experience, there are certain things for ADHD that are much harder to shift than other things. Emotional regulation is absolutely possible to shift, and it's just how much conscious effort that we want to put into this stuff. So that's a bit of a that's a bit of a background on the ADHD processing system when it comes to emotional regulation. So hopefully by now you'll be able to see that emotional regulation is a little bit more difficult genetically. But what is her name? Deborah something. She's an expert on the autonomic nervous system. And she says that biology shapes experience. Her last name will come to me. But biology shapes experience. So whoever the person was that said that they're always kind of seeing things in that way. So biology shapes experience. So what your genetics are, what your biology is, yes, that will shape your perception. But then she also says experience shapes biology. So it's like a circle. So every time we change our experience just a tiny bit. So if we're able to come out of that perception, that black and white thinking, and think, oh, maybe it wasn't that. Maybe that friend is in trouble. Maybe they're not mad at me. Every time we have a different experience of something and we have a different thought, that starts to get wired that way, right? What fires together, wires together. Hebb's axiom. And Dan Siegel says, I think I've got him later on, but he says, where neural firing grows, where neural firing goes, neural connection flows, right? It fires together, it wires together. So again, that couple of people that gave those examples of how their wiring has started to change, absolutely true. So the mindfulness aspect. So how mindfulness keeps the whole brain online, right? We're talking about this, we're talking about that working in perfect harmony. Outside of us comes the stimulus. Actually, sometimes inside of us too, right? Our thoughts can be the stimulus. So anything that's happening to our body, so it hits the amygdala. Now, without mindfulness, without this kind of prefrontal cortex, we just get stuck in this reaction, and we're just kind of unconsciously reacting to things. And I think I said earlier, it's over 90% of us is over 90% of our thoughts, our actions, our behaviors are all running on automatic. So unless we insert mindfulness here, and what is mindfulness, right? It's that space. It's that space between stimulus and response. And with mindfulness practice, we're growing that space. So when we're growing that space, our prefrontal cortex is staying online. We're able to consciously process. We're no longer just running on this automatic reactive programming, conscious. What do I want to choose as my response, internally and externally? So, mindfulness is really kind of shifting that to this more thoughtful, everything running. So, Viktor Frankl, one of my favorite quotes, he said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And within that space lies our freedom and growth, right? And it's absolutely true. Such a beautiful quote. So, what are we doing when we are practicing mindfulness? Most of you in this room, it sounds like you're all kind of across it, so you probably know this. And the reason I put this in is because the majority of people in this world today, that word mindfulness is quite stigmatized, isn't it? And many people think that mindfulness is this toxic positivity, it's this clearing your mind. Whereas we know that proper mindfulness couldn't be further from the truth, right? We're not checking out, we are checking in. Like, what is happening in our internal system so that we can create a choice. So when we are practicing this mindfulness thing, we're down regulating our nervous system. We're stepping out of this doing mode, this kind of unconscious patterning that we're going throughout our day, and we're able to separate, right? We're like becoming the observer. What is happening in my mind? What's happening in my body? Let's get curious about that. And when we practice mindfulness, this perception thing, we're coming out of judgment and we are swapping judgment for curiosity. Oh, noticed my judging, noticed that thought. What's happening? We're not necessarily trying to change them, but we're just noticing everything. So we're activating our body's system, our parasympathetic nervous system, by just coming outside of ourselves, viewing ourselves. Awareness of the mind, it is our superpower. Just being aware, not getting caught in these thoughts. I remember actually when I first ever went to this intro to mindfulness many years ago, and the lady said, we have around 70,000 thoughts a day. And I can remember I thought, are you crazy? What are you even talking about? No, we don't. And over the next few weeks, it was like this revelation. Oh, wow, look at that thought. Look at that thought. So this awareness that our thoughts are just events in the mind, right? Just like we saw with that martial arts stand, just like we saw with all of our perceptions, our mind changes all of the time, all of the time. And this awareness of the body, our bodies are giving us signals. So say we can feel anger in our head, in our tummy, wherever we feel it. Oh, just felt anger. I'm going to catch that signal and I'm going to come outside of myself and think, where did that come from? What's happening right now? So we're pattern interrupting. So I thought it might be helpful to look at this life cycle of an emotion today, should say emotions and thoughts probably, because there's this pattern that happens, right? This neuroception. It's like this, the body scanning for threat. I think it was a couple of 100 times a minute. Am I safe? Am I not safe? What's happening? We're moving towards or away. The stimulus is happening, the outside event. Now our amygdala is responding, right? Now our amygdala is saying, I'm not safe. Now we've got this emotion. Before we know it, the emotion, which is our body's messaging system, but our bodies can't speak, right? So it gives us this emotion. And before we know it, everything that we're carrying with us in our lives is attached to this emotion. Now we're bringing a thought. Now we're in a story, right? And we live mostly in story. Very rarely are our stories utterly true. So now we've got 35,000 decisions a day that we're making in response to our story, to this story that we are in. So any time that we can interrupt this life cycle, any time that we can stop ourselves either at stimulus or emotion, at thoughts, is that necessarily true? What serves me? What choice am I going to make that will serve me in this moment that will serve the good of everyone? So by practicing mindfulness, we've got this automatic checks and balances system, right? We're not running out of our automatic programming anymore. And this Harvard brain scientist, Jill Bolt-Taylor, absolutely love it. She said, it's shown that it only takes 90 seconds to identify an emotion and have it processed through you, right? This energy, it's a 90-second chemical process, happens in the body. But what she says is that it's the thoughts, right? It's that story. If we go back here to the end, our thoughts and our behaviors and our actions, this last bit is what keeps us in that stress response, in that emotion. So once we're able to get curious and not kind of bash it or resist it or get stuck in the story, we're able to let go of it and hold it more lightly. There was once a analogy that I heard and I loved it. Pain times resistance equals suffering, right? I think it may be from Buddhism. I'm not too sure. But so if the pain is a 5 and the resistance to it is a 10, now you've got a suffering of 50. But if the pain is a 5 and the resistance is 0, what do we have now, right? So the suffering becomes less when we're not resisting it. So in relation to the ADHD system, pharmaceuticals, so say pills to help, sure, they're great, but they do not teach skills, right? They don't change your neuroplasticity. And I'm not against medicine in any form, but this focused development, what hasn't been learned can be learned. And what's been learned that's detrimental to us can be unlearned. So Gabor Mate, who's a expert on trauma, and I love what he says about trauma. He says it's not the event that happens, it's our perception of the event that happens. It's everything we take from it. And like he says, the answer to underdevelopment is development. We know this neuroplasticity stuff, right? Not for long, the last 30 years or whatever it is, but we know this. We know that we can change our wiring. We just have to be conscious about it. And mindfulness, so far, is probably the most highest quality way that I have seen to regulate the nervous system, to come out of that unconscious, to notice where we are in our window of tolerance, and to be able to change our physiology, to be able to not have these responses. I know for me, it's certainly changed my physiology. So I am definitely within that statistic that it says it reduces the amygdala response and increases the prefrontal response. Yeah. So hopefully today that has given you, hopefully you will be able to go away with something valuable that you can take from this, from that combination of that, the ADHD side and the emotional regulation and the mindfulness. Thank you, everybody. And I think, Katya, do we have questions and Q&A?
Yes, please. I was just about, first of all, thank you so very much. Yes, Darren, yes. You actually put a neat, clear a neuroscientific perspective on spiritual development and what we need to do. ADHD or even not ADHD diagnosed people, because emotions are crucial, and we talked about emotional intelligence as well in different contexts, and how important it is to be able to understand what we're feeling and be able to navigate and manage those feelings, and dealing with resistance as well. Fantastic. Thank you so very much. And I would love to hear questions or comments from our audience today, because we have some fantastic experts here. Thank you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is saying that was helpful and engaging. Thank you. Oh, yes, Darren, please. And
I think Jody had her real hand up, and then she switched to the emoticon. So I will take second place.
That's
Jody, it's yours.
Wonderful. Jody.
Yeah, sorry. Mine only lets me do it through the physical hand raising and recognizes it for some reason. I'd just be curious if there are any specific things that you would suggest someone with ADHD has to be mindful of? So there's, I guess you can have a mindfulness practice and just generally, you know, cultivate habits around being more present. But say for myself, and that's why I asked the question around trauma and ADHD, because I think it got exacerbated for me at that point. But I find it very hard, for example, like to focus just on this session without trying to multitask on a bunch of other things. But I have a sense, and interesting, I just had a course with Katya, where like this continual partial attention really resonated with me. And I sense that resisting that would be better, that by fueling it, the desire to just do multiple things or try to do multiple things is actually probably causing more of a problem. So that's, I guess that's what I'm interested in. Is there anything specific that you would suggest, you know, you should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me, the way that you just described it, it sounds to me like the awareness is there, but it's the pull towards the doing the multiple things. So it's like there's awareness and then there's motivation, right?
Yeah.
Just like we have an awareness that we should practice mindfulness, but do we have the motivation? So I actually ran last year a whole workshop on ADHD and multitasking, because a lot of people with ADHD are under the mistaken belief that they can multitask wonderfully and that's how they work best. But there's a lot of science that shows it's really bad for every human. So in answer to your question, is there anything that you could suggest for people with ADHD to not, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing is to not get distracted, say when they're doing this, listening to a webinar? Or
it's not so much that. I was just using that as an example. Like I would say that would probably be a fairly typical thing. So it was just more, are there any practical sort of tips, I guess, of things that people with ADHD should maybe be mindful of, like that? So only try and do one thing at a time. Resist the temptation to multitask.
Yes,
is there anything else?
For people with ADHD, you probably know this already, but like fiddling with things, or I had a client once that said she was dreading this online course because even though she wanted to know the information, she just fell asleep unless she got distracted. So through the course of that session, what we discovered, and this is true for most people with ADHD, is that sometimes we actually listen better when we're doing a secondary task that doesn't require your prefrontal cortex. So say if you're doing the washing up or folding the laundry or painting a wall or something that doesn't require your actual attention, sometimes we're able to actually tune in better. So for that multitasking, but you also said if there's anything else to be mindful of?
Just things you see commonly occur.
Yeah, so things I see commonly is that, I guess in relation to today, the perception and the self-regulation, the things that I see commonly are that people with ADHD in general have a conflicted sense of self. So what I mean by that is they know that they're bright and beautiful and true and all of these kind of things, but they also, because of the world we live in, they also have a huge inner critic. So that's where that rejection sensitivity as well comes from. So in a lot of my clients, I see them kind of playing small. Is that how I would describe it? Or second guessing themselves a lot. So being mindful of raising your sense of self, being with people that you feel like you belong with, not that you're trying to fit in with. And I've done a lot of work around, I don't know if you've heard Brené Brown's research on fitting in, and it's the opposite of belonging. So most people with ADHD have been trying to fit in all their life, and that just exacerbates these symptoms more, and it throws you out of that window of tolerance more when you're not feeling completely regulated and belonging. So that's another one that I would be mindful of, just that self-talk, and that how can we change that self-talk? And you actually really can. Yeah. Takes time. It's that wiring, right?
Yeah, I found Eckhart Tolle. I didn't come at it from that level, but yeah, that observing the inner critic and challenging the inner critic, that made a huge difference for me.
Yeah. And sometimes you have to borrow belief in yourself as well. I have many clients that kind of don't believe in themselves, but when you find somebody that truly believes in you, then that raises you too.
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Darren, and we also after that have a question from Nancy in the chat. But Darren, you're welcome.
Thank you, Katya. And Jen, first of all, just thank you. Someone who's heard this material in different formats over the years, the way that you've storyboarded it together for us, ADHD, so as a perfect trifecta, ADHD, trauma impacted, and continues to want to work frontline trauma work as a way of keeping things interesting. Thank you very much, because it was a really lovely presentation. But again, I'm on a quest as well to, again, this is why I'm here. This is our tribe. But how do I really try to get into that space? Because life provides me with plenty of stimulus. So I've got that part mastered. So I get plenty of opportunities daily, weekly. So that space in between, how do I get there? And I want to honor also that we have Incon here. So if he's got a tip, please, somebody help me. Thank you.
I just want to make sure that I understand your question. Are you saying you have plenty of stimulus and you have lots to do in the doing mode, but how do you get to the being? And do you practice mindfulness already?
I have a great practice. It just eludes me, and my inner critic keeps reminding me, why try, give it up. That voice is really strong. So yeah.
Yeah. And, there's different ways. I mean, obviously, many of my clients are not into practicing mindfulness because it's too difficult for them to get to for long, but different ways of being, right? Because what is being? Being is just being present. So it's not being there, it's being here, whether you're stimulated or not. So that being, I don't know that it would necessarily have to mean not being stimulated in any way, but that down regulation of the nervous system. And there's all sorts of activities that you can do to undertake that, right? Say yin yoga or all sorts of different things for people that aren't necessarily in that I can sit still and do that mindfulness practice. So there's many ways to get to the being, I suppose. I'm interested in, did you say that somebody else might be able to speak on that?
I was going to say, just another former teacher who I haven't seen in years is sitting there. Not to name any names, Incon, but just knowing that we have great practitioners in the room. That I'm looking for help, but yes.
I'm waiting. I'm a coach, so I can stay silent for a long time. But I'm just, I'm not going to put anybody in a position.
I can tell. I was just mentioning you. Oh, I can see Incon's mics come off. Hi.
Hi, Darren. Thanks for the invite. But I think Jody is handling your question extremely well, and I don't have too much to add to it. Or do you want to add anything more to the issue or the question you've raised, Darren?
No, I think it's that just learning to be first of all, and then the rest hopefully we'll pull that information back online. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the being is not always easy, is it? What is it John Cabot says? It's simple but not easy. But there are different ways for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a question from Christine as well. Thank you so much, Darren, and fantastic question and very deep. Warrants another good session, I suppose, of which we might think further on for the conversations. We had a question from Nancy. Was it a question from Nancy or Meredith? Oh, give me a second.
Nancy's put one on the chat and
on the chat, yeah. Oh, yes. Do you think the pharma treatments could be reduced with development of mindfulness? That was Nancy's question.
Yeah, if we're thinking about it in terms of emotional regulation, there's a couple of pharma treatments. I think Gravazine is one of them. Dr. William Dodson said that say rejection sensitivity, which is just emotional dysregulation, can be treated with these medications. But mindfulness also, if it changes your physiology, then of course it helps your emotional regulation, right? So yes is my answer. I do think that they could probably, and that's a very, again, let me just preface that with that's a subjective opinion and from experience rather than a research base. But yes, I do think so. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Christine. You need to unmute yourself.
Is that better?
Yep.
Yes, yes. Thank you for all the information. It's been really interesting, and all the questions. My thoughts have been going to sometimes when we have a neurodivergent type way of processing. We think of all the difficulties it causes, but we have great strengths too. And sometimes there's like combining what might be difficulties and work well. So I'm just thinking that I'm finding walking meditation is a good thing for mindfulness for someone who has trouble perhaps sitting still or keeping a single focus, because that way I'm not resisting anything, but I'm drawing on the capacity to multitask and multi-focus, but still achieving that sense of creating space. It was just a thought I was wanting to throw in.
Oh,
and I doodle constantly in listening, and before I knew that it was anything from my younger days to concentrate, I doodle, and I have quite beautiful circular rhythmic doodles that I can't ever repeat, but that keeps me focused and also gives me a sense of aesthetic pleasure and the line control, but at the same time I'm concentrating.
love that.
Yeah,
Yes.
and my son who is similar, I used to draw cartoons through school, and his teacher said to me once, "Oh, he's always drawing." And she said, "He's not listening." And I said, "If you ask him something, can he answer the question?" She said, "Well, yes, he can." I said, "So he's listening because he's drawing, So we have strengths as well. There are strengths that we can call on. And sometimes we get caught up in the deficits of our, so-called deficit.
Yes.
And your comment about having an abundance of attention, we can use that too.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I agree. The medical model is very deficits focused. The coaching model is a lot more strengths based. It's like, well, let's stop focusing on these deficits, because just like a neurotypical person has strengths and challenges, we have stronger strengths, I think, and weaker challenges. So it's almost like this more of an extreme. But you're absolutely right. I would not change my processing system for the world. And interestingly, on the emotional side, there was this there's some research done by Thomas, I can't remember his last name. It's on orchids, if anybody's heard of it, but talking about how highly sensitive people can, if they're in the wrong environment, then they can disproportionately be whatever the opposite to thrive is, I can't think of the word, but in the right environments, they actually disproportionately thrive. So it's like this kind of paradox. So yeah, this mega strengths. Yeah. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, everyone. Just very quickly on the last comment here from Jody, who's also wondering if pharma can create this space for people to put in place strategies and then in turn reduce the pharma support. That seemed to be the case with her children and particularly his son. So
yes. And so the answer to that from what I've seen is it depends. It depends on the person. So I'd say 70% of my client base find pharmaceuticals helpful in one aspect, but not particularly helpful. It's almost like a cost-benefit analysis. I have probably 15 to 20% of clients that say it actually changes their emotions and it changes that emotional space for them and their reactivity. And then I have a small amount of clients who don't touch medication at all. It makes them anxious. So that's why I say it depends. But you do have some people with pharmaceuticals that creates that space. And then they have to learn, if they want to come off the meds, they have to learn to create that space themselves. So not for everybody, but for some people. Yeah, that's what I've seen.
If I might come in now, and it might help Darren with what I say now. I think, Jody, your talk today is terrific, and it
Jen.
points out how mindfulness, Jen, I mean, your talk today is really beautiful. But in a way, you're saying mindfulness perhaps is the first step when an ADHD person or a post-trauma individual has to deal with, because mindfulness, in a sense, simply slows it down, and it gives us, in that pause, we can then use many other techniques to help us along.
Is
With
it
regards medications, yes, there's a place for it, but as you say, Jody, is not a be-all and end-all. But after the general mindfulness that we all need to learn, even those of us without ADHD, mindfulness is useful for so many other things, is that we then add for the ADHD clients, for those of us who have ADHD, not forgetting the point, very interestingly, with the ADHD, we are also born with certain strengths, as someone mentioned just now. And then we can use some mindfulness exercises to actually help those strengths grow. And one of them is compassion. Every ADHD individual who learns to practice the meditation on self-compassion, to actually realize that they're not at fault and they don't have any basic fault, but they're just born that way neurotypically. But in the self-compassion, it can include for the ADHD individual, strange enough, but more and more documented now, somehow ADHD individuals have a high compassion index, and they can use self-compassion to help themselves in many difficult situations.
Really can.
Plus the other specific meditations, loving kindness, joy, equanimity, they all help case by case. As we understand the ADHD client, we can then apply some more mindfulness-based meditations that helps that client specifically. I hope what I say might satisfy Darren a little bit more.
As always, it did.
Thank you so much. We're over time. Oh, I wish we had more time. Oh, Jen, thank you so very much. And
Thank you for
yes,
having me.
Gong, thank you for your wonderful comments and very, very valuable comments. And Jen, fantastic presentation, fantastic conversation. So many our participants today wrote, oh yeah, Darren said, I look forward to the next workshop. Yay! We will organize something, that's for sure. Many wrote and asked for your presentation, and I will do that. I did write my email address here in the chat, but if for whatever reason, and I know many here who ask, so we don't need that, so I'll just write to you. But if I don't know your email address and I don't hear from you, I'll just ask my colleagues to help with that. And just before we finish, please do keep an eye on our social media pages for more information. As at NTI, we will continue our engaging, thought-provoking, and community-building conversations. Thank you, everyone, again for attending. And Jen, What a fantastic hour. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Katya, for hosting, and thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. See you next time.